Imagine the 18th century, the ocean, not boundless romance, but a floating hell. On the decks of His Majesty's ships, under the scorching sun or in the icy wind, an invisible slaughter unfolded. Not enemy cannons, not storms. Something far more insidious and merciless decimated the crews. Scurvy, a word that chilled any sailor to the bone. It was the plague of the seas, incurable, inexplicable. Decades before James Cook circumnavigated the globe, this disease had already claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of sailors. Gums rotted, teeth fell out, old wounds suddenly reopened and bled. Skin became covered in black spots, joints swelled, and then came the agony. Slow, humiliating, and inevitable. For centuries, doctors and captains were powerless, offering absurd cures, from sulfuric acid to vinegar. Nothing worked. Death reigned supreme across the vast expanses of water. But amidst this despair, in 1747, aboard the British warship HMS Salisbury, ship's surgeon James Lind decided on the unthinkable. He was not an academic, nor an armchair scientist. He was a practitioner who saw suffering every day. He took 12 of his sailors, each slowly being killed by scurvy. He divided them into 6 pairs, and to each pair he assigned their own prescription. One pair received vinegar, another cider, a third seawater, and to 2 unfortunate doomed pairs he gave what was considered a strange, almost mad experiment. One pair received 2 oranges, the other 1 lemon, daily. What he did was not just treatment, it was something entirely new. What we today call the first clinical trial in history. With control groups, with systematic observation. For the first time in medicine, instead of blindly following dogmas, a man used pure experimentation. He observed, recorded, compared. He was looking not for a miracle, but for proof. The result? After 6 days, those who received citrus fruits didn't just feel better. They were healthy. Their gums healed. Their strength returned. Scurvy retreated. The victory was complete, scientifically proven. But the world didn't rush to embrace him. It would be another 50 years before the British fleet finally adopted his recommendations. Tens of thousands of lives could have been saved sooner. But tradition, inertia, and distrust of the new proved stronger than obvious truth. For scientific discovery is rarely an epiphany, a sudden flash of genius that changes everything overnight. More often, it is painstaking, exhausting work. A slow, sometimes agonizing accumulation of data. It is a struggle against prejudice, against rigid thinking. And James Lind's story is the clearest confirmation of this. It is a story of how one of the greatest medical achievements was buried in indifference for decades. Imagine a world where disease is not merely a malfunction of the body, but something far more sinister, a divine punishment, an imbalance of 4 mystical fluids, or even a cunning curse. In the 18th century, when scurvy decimated thousands of crews at sea, medicine itself was in deep stagnation, chained by centuries-old dogmas. Its foundation was not observation and experimentation, but merely centuries-old rewritings of ancient Roman and Greek authorities. Galen, Hippocrates, their words remained absolute, unquestionable law. Any, even the slightest deviation from these truths, was considered not just an error, but dangerous free-thinking, bordering on heresy. Doctors educated in universities did not learn to observe patients, analyze symptoms, or seek new paths. They learned to interpret ancient texts. They believed that diseases were caused by invisible bad humors, or vapors, and all treatment boiled down to desperate attempts to expel these mystical humors or disperse the vapors. This was not science, but a complex, sometimes bloody ritual, where logic gave way to blind tradition and effectiveness to mere belief in authority. Patients, desperately seeking help, encountered methods that today would make one's blood run cold. If a wound bled, it might be cauterized black with a red-hot iron, believing that fire would cleanse the affected area. Open fractures, already a death sentence due to infection, were doused with boiling oil or even tar, supposedly to prevent contamination. Pus, which we now know is a grave sign of inflammation and bacterial infection, was then considered laudable, evidence that the body was actively cleansing itself of disease. Doctors welcomed its appearance, not realizing it only exacerbated suffering and hastened death. Bloodletting was a universal panacea, applied for every conceivable illness. A liter, 2, or even 3 liters of blood might be drawn from a patient in a single session to expel bad humors and restore mythical balance. The intestines were purged with strong, often toxic laxatives and emetics, bringing patients to complete exhaustion. Pain? Pain was not a signal of a problem, but part of the process, proof that the medicine was working and the disease was receding. And if a patient, exhausted by disease and treatment, eventually died, it was not the doctor's failure, but inevitability, the will of heaven, or simply treatment started too late. For decades, centuries, this system did not evolve. It merely strengthened in its rigidity, passing on misconceptions from generation to generation. Every new doctor learned the same outdated theories as his predecessors. No one asked questions. No one demanded proof. Success was measured not by patient recovery, but by strict adherence to ancient dogma. Thousands, tens of thousands of lives were lost not only to the diseases themselves, but also to this barbaric treatment that only multiplied suffering. In this grim world, where suffering was the norm and progress was heresy, medicine remained in deep stagnation, powerless in the face of true threats. It was not salvation, but another, sometimes the most terrible ordeal. And it was this barrier of inertia, ignorance, and blind faith that needed to be overcome. James Lind, the man destined to change the course of medical history, was born in 1717 in Edinburgh, Scotland. His origins were humble. He did not belong to the elite, nor did he have connections in high circles that could secure his path to prestigious universities. His education began not with the study of ancient treatises, but with practical apprenticeship. At 15, Lind became an apprentice to a local surgeon. The years spent in the clinic taught him not only the basics of anatomy and first aid, but more importantly, direct observation. He saw how patients reacted to treatment, how diseases developed, how desperately they sought help. It was a harsh but invaluable experience that shaped his view of medicine, a view based on reality, not on dogmas. At 23, James Lind joined the Royal Navy. He became a ship's surgeon. This was not just a job. It was a daily struggle for survival in conditions that armchair scientists could not even conceive of. His office was the deck of a warship. His patients, hundreds of sailors, confined in cramped, damp quarters, doomed to encounter the most terrible diseases of the time. Throughout years of service on vessels like HMS Salisbury, Lind observed a horrifying panorama. He saw how scurvy, this plague of the seas, decimated crews more mercilessly than any storm or enemy fire. He saw how strong men, the pride of the fleet, turned into living corpses. Their gums rotted, teeth fell out, old scars reopened and bled. Bodies were covered in black spots, joints swelled to monstrous sizes, and then came the long and agonizing death. The entire system he worked within offered only the same archaic treatments as centuries before. Bloodletting to complete exhaustion, cauterization with red-hot iron, emetics leading to dehydration, miraculous elixirs based on superstition and astrology, not facts. Lind himself applied these methods, and he saw their complete catastrophic ineffectiveness. Day after day, month after month, years of naval service convinced him of one thing: what was taught in universities, what authorities prescribed, simply did not work. Diseases did not recede. Death collected its harvest on board. He was not a theoretician confined to a university library. He was a practitioner who faced reality every day. His laboratory was 6 sailors. His data, their agony and death. Unlike many of his colleagues, who simply accepted failures as a given, as God's will or inevitability, Lind began to ask questions. These questions were not about how to interpret the ancient texts of Galen or Hippocrates more accurately. His questions were different. Why did some methods work and others not? Why did some sailors, despite identical conditions, suffer less? He sought not explanations from the past, but answers for the future. It was this experience accumulated over years of service that sowed the seeds of doubt in his mind. He saw that official medicine was powerless. He saw that its methods not only did not help, but often exacerbated suffering. Amidst the boundless ocean, far from dogmas and authorities, ideas began to form in his mind. Ideas that seemed insane in a world where blind faith was more important than evidence, and experiment was considered a dangerous heresy. He began to think not about how to interpret ancient dogmas, but about how to observe, compare, and verify. This was a man hardened by sea service, imbued with despair at the impotence of traditional medicine in the face of a real threat. A man who sought not glory or recognition, but simply a way to stop the suffering he saw every day. His approach was radical. He was ready to cast aside centuries of dogmas to find a truth that neither ancient texts nor university doctors could provide. He was ready to start with a clean slate. On board the Salisbury, despair reigned. Scurvy didn't just cripple, it killed. Dozens of sailors lay helpless, their bodies turning into open, festering wounds. Skin was covered in black spots, joints swelled to monstrous sizes. Every day Lind saw this agony. He saw how powerless all the usual remedies were: bloodletting, cauterization, emetics, everything he himself was forced to use. He saw how strong men, the pride of the fleet, turned into living corpses, and no ancient dogmas could stop it. Then, in 1747, in the middle of the boundless ocean, Lind made a decision. It was not a simple medical act. It was a challenge to centuries of ingrained misconceptions. He did not seek new treatises, nor did he pray. He decided to test. The situation demanded not faith, but facts. He needed answers, urgently, and he understood. These answers could not be found in old books, only in observation, only in comparison. He chose 12 sailors, the most severely ill, those whom scurvy was slowly but surely leading to death. All were in a similar critical condition. Their gums were rotting, teeth loose, joints swollen, old wounds reopening. All were doomed if nothing changed. Lind divided them into 6 pairs, placing each in the most identical conditions possible on a warship. To each pair, he assigned one of the most popular, yet unproven remedies of the time. 2 sailors received 2 quarts of cider daily. Another 2 received 25 drops of sulfuric acid, diluted in water, then considered a powerful antiseptic. The next pair received 2 spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times a day. 2 others received seawater, which many considered a panacea for all sea illnesses. Yet another pair received a mixture of garlic, mustard, myrrh, and other herbs, a popular, though exotic recipe. And now, the most important part, the most revolutionary. To the last 2 sailors, he gave what was considered exotic, a luxury, something completely unrelated to medicine, but which was available on the ship. 1 pair received 2 oranges daily, the other 1 lemon. This was not an act of blind faith in citrus fruits. It was a pure, rigorous experiment. Lind didn't just give medicines. He created controlled groups. He systematically recorded every change: skin color, gum condition, pain level, appetite, general well-being. He documented every detail, every breath, every sign of improvement or deterioration. Days dragged on slowly. The situation in most groups did not change. Sailors receiving vinegar, cider, seawater, sulfuric acid, or herbal mixtures continued to fade. Their suffering did not diminish. Their bodies remained emaciated. Their gums bled. But in the groups receiving citrus, something incredible happened. After just 6 days, their gums stopped bleeding. The black spots on their skin began to fade. The pain subsided. Men who just yesterday were confined to their bunks began to get up. They ate. They moved. Their strength returned with astonishing speed. The disease that had decimated crews for centuries receded. Completely. In 6 days. This was no accident. No miracle sent from heaven. This was proof. Proof obtained by a method that no one in medicine before Lind had applied so purposefully and systematically. He didn't just find a remedy. He found a way to find remedies. He showed that truth was not in ancient texts, not in mystical theories, but in careful observation, comparison, and verification. For the first time in history, medicine ceased to be blind faith in authorities and became a science based on facts. This was a turning point that changed not only the fates of sailors, but also the very concept of how to treat a person. Lind didn't just conduct an experiment on the Salisbury. He thought differently. His mind was set on finding causes, not just describing symptoms. He didn't take millennia-old dogmas on faith. He saw their failure. Every day he observed how bloodletting and cauterization only hastened death. This was his first, most bitter lesson. Old methods don't work. He understood. To find the truth, one must discard authorities. One must observe and compare. His genius manifested in the creation of a new cognitive framework. He didn't just give different medicines. He systematically recorded every bodily reaction: skin color, gum condition, changes in appetite, pain level. He collected data. This was not a ritual, but strict, almost laboratory work on the deck of a warship. He transformed the chaos of disease into an organized table. This approach, systematic observation, with control groups, became his main tool, a new way of knowing in medicine. He didn't invent the scalpel, but he invented a method that was far sharper. Lind also understood, discovery without dissemination is nothing. In 1753, he published his Treatise of the Scurvy, a detailed report of his experiment and conclusions. He wrote it in English, not traditional Latin. This was a conscious step. He wanted his work to be accessible not only to learned scholars but also to ordinary ship surgeons, army doctors, everyone who encountered this disease. He wasn't just transmitting knowledge. He was building a bridge between the academic ivory tower and the reality of the battlefield, the reality of sea voyages. His path was not paved with roses. The results of the experiment were astonishing, but the world was slow to accept them. For decades, his recommendations were ignored. This was a time when learned scholars preferred to debate the subtleties of ancient texts rather than implement the radical ideas of a ship's surgeon. But Lind did not back down. He continued to write, refine his arguments, and provide new evidence. He did not try to convince the old system directly. He simply presented proof, again and again, hoping that the clarity of facts would break through the wall of inertia. His persistence, his belief in the power of data, not the power of authority, were as revolutionary as the experiment itself. He learned from every rejection, not falling into despair, but only strengthening his conviction. He saw that not only disease kills, but also ignorance, and he dedicated his life to fighting both. He was not a lone genius, creating in a vacuum. He was a practitioner who elevated empiricism, observation, and systematic analysis to the level of a scientific method applicable to humans. He laid the foundation for what we now call evidence-based medicine. His Salisbury was not just a ship. It was the first scientific laboratory where a person's fate was decided not by prayer, but by precise measurement. But precise measurement and undeniable facts proved powerless against centuries of inertia. When James Lind published his Treatise of the Scurvy in 1753, the medical world, bound by dogma, did not embrace it. On the contrary, his work, detailed and clear, did not cause a sensation. It landed on the desks of leading physicians and admiralty officials, most of whom met it with cold indifference or even outright disdain. The main argument against Lind was simple. He was merely a ship's surgeon, not an academic, not a professor, not a graduate of prestigious universities where Galen and Hippocrates reigned. His experiment on 12 sailors seemed to them no more than a curious coincidence. How can one trust conclusions drawn from such a small sample, they questioned. Where are the strict logical chains based on centuries of work, not on some observation? They saw him as an upstart, infringing upon established authorities, upon the very structure of medical knowledge. His method, based on comparison and verification, was alien to them, almost heretical. It did not fit into their worldview, where truth was obtained not in a dirty hold, but in dusty university libraries. Moreover, the very idea that scurvy was simply a lack of some substance was offensive to their complex theories. For them, diseases were the result of an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or a consequence of bad miasmas, harmful vapors floating in the air. The suggestion of treating a deadly disease with a few fruits? It seemed too simple, almost primitive, unworthy of the attention of serious scholars. It undermined their entire world, built on complex rituals of bloodletting, cauterization, and bodily purging. They could not accept that the solution could be so elementary when they had spent decades searching for it in convoluted theories and costly, often lethal procedures. To this were added practical objections, which conveniently served as a cover for intellectual resistance. Citrus fruits? Too expensive, Admiralty officials declared, and too difficult to store on long voyages. They spoil quickly. We cannot supply the entire fleet with them. Instead of seeking ways to solve logistical problems, they preferred to cling to old, useless remedies. They continued to fund research into miraculous elixirs and mixtures that yielded no results. Lynn's work was not directly forbidden, but it was simply ignored. It was actively pushed out of the agenda, promoting other, useless theories and methods. It was not an open battle, but a suffocating indifference that slowly but surely buried Lynn's breakthrough under tons of centuries-old prejudice and bureaucratic inertia. However, not everyone was blind. Some, albeit few, saw Lynn's work not as a threat, but as salvation. Among them were not only individual practicing doctors, but also far-sighted figures within the Navy itself. They saw thousands of sailors continuing to die and understood. Old methods were not working. Lord Anson, who himself had endured the horrors of scurvy during his circumnavigation, and Admiral Richard Howe, supported Lynn's ideas, seeing them not as theoretical speculation, but as real salvation for their crews. It was thanks to these supporters, despite the resistance of the medical establishment, that Lynn received his appointment as chief physician at Haslar Royal Naval Hospital in 1758. This was not a triumph, but an important step. He gained a platform, an opportunity to continue his research and influence practice, albeit slowly. His ideas did not die. They simply waited for their moment,